very warm welcome to this seminar that we titled Making the Two Ends of Eurasia Meet, Prospects of the Middle Corridor in the Trump Era. And we have a great panel with us today to discuss this topic. The Middle Corridor Initiative, or the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, precedes Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I want to use this opportunity to express our solidarity with Ukraine, with the people of Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. But the initiative was launched prior to the invasion in 2013. It was initiated by Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and Turkey. It became more known to the international public during the pandemic, when it was used kind of more intensely because of the blockage of maritime routes, but it received a real boost with the beginning of the war, because it created this sense of urgency among the countries of the region, also among Europeans, and we saw the EU backing the project very, very actively. Americans under the Biden administration also supported the initiative. We saw China increasingly interested in the route as well. So now with the Trump administration, the realities are changing at neck-breaking speed, and we thought it would be good for us to gather experts and to discuss what is changing, what is changing in the assessments, calculations of the two big powers, two big ends of the Middle Corridor. What Europeans are thinking, how the drivers and constraints on their end are changing or not changing, what is happening on the other side in China. So let's do that today. Let me introduce our panelists in the order I will ask them to speak. First, we will hear from Samuel Dobry-Westerby, who is a managing director at the European Neighborhood Council. He specializes in Turkey, Central Asia, and the Middle East. He oversees ENC research projects across the neighborhood and Central Asia, including academic council members and regional strategy. His research is focused on EU-MENA, EU-Turkey relations and trade, accession, energy, migration, and regional neighborhood policy. Thank you for joining us today, Samuel. Then we will go to Yunis Sharifli, who is an independent foreign policy analyst specializing in China's engagement with Central Asia and the South Caucasus, with a focus on energy and connectivity. He has previously served as a research fellow at the Central Asia Barometer and the Caucasian Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. Welcome, Yunis.
Thank you.
Last but not least, we will hear from Timur Umarov, a longtime friend of the program. He's a fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. His research focuses on Central Asian countries' domestic and foreign policies, and China's relations with Russia and its Central Asian neighbors. Welcome, Timur.
Thanks for having me.
So without further ado, let me go to you, Samuel. What's happening on the European front? Why is EU interested in the Middle Corridor? What do you think is going to happen in this new world we are living in? We're kind of now living in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Casanova. As our esteemed academic council member of ENC, I want to thank you. Also thank the Davis Center at Harvard for hosting us virtually today. And also, of course, to the other speakers, some of whom I'm very happy to see. And I don't always get to see you in person, but I'm happy to see you online. So you asked me about EU Central Asia relations today, and I think talking about EU Central Asia relations comes at really an excellent time. We've chosen a perfect time since the EU Central Asia and also its Central Asian counterparts are preparing for a summit in about exactly a month from now, on the 3rd and the 4th of April. So this summit is quite historical in the sense that it will unite the leaders of all the 5 Central Asian countries or republics, and it's a summit, so it will also bring in the President of the European Commission as well as the President of the European Council, so Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. And so that's the first time that happens in the history of EU Central Asia relations. And so I'm quite happy to be able to talk as it fits very well with that agenda. Maybe just let me outline. I will just talk about 3 things based on this question you just asked. Or I think the 3 most appropriate things would be to talk about exactly like you mentioned, what are the interests of the EU in Central Asia, vice versa also, what are the interests of the region in the EU, and maybe also like a little bit about the lead up in relations this year and the summit coming up. So maybe if I just cut away all the fluff, because I don't think we have so much time, you can group the reasons for why the EU is interested in Central Asia into 2 things. One is economic and the other one is geostrategic. And from an economic point of view, the Central Asian region offers renewable energy and gas, critical raw materials, including also uranium, skilled labor, high literacy, which falls under skilled labor. Well, actually, not only high literacy, also high female employment. Of course, very youthful population. The demographic cones of Central Asia are, unfortunately for us, at least in the EU, but also in China and most places actually around the world today, demographically are the opposite. That's a positive. Relatively good infrastructure. Of course, it depends on where you go. Not every single place in Central Asia is well connected or has good infrastructure, but some places do, and increasingly more do. There is little to no conflict. Of course, there has been conflict in different places, but increasingly compared to the rest of the world, it's relatively conflict-free for now. And also, there is a potential of developing supply chain hubs, especially for European industry and also for other industry for that sake. So I think it's fair to say that at the moment, Central Asia is very much viewed by the US as some type of pawn in a chessboard. The Chinese maybe view it as a source of energy, especially Turkmenistan, but increasingly also as a source of supply chains and minerals, or maybe reserve minerals would be the better word. And Russia sees it as its backyard. I mean, Russia is a country that, bar the last few months where it's had its kind of total revitalization because of Donald Trump's reverse policy on Russia. Russia has essentially gone through a total decay economically and a total decay militarily over the last many years. And as a result, it doesn't really have the leverage in the region anymore as it used to, but it of course still has security ties and other things. And so the EU, if you compare it to all these other actors, the EU is offering industrialization and it's offering to interlink economies together in order to create a form of Central Asia regional integration with various degrees of technology transfer, local processing, and usage of minerals, not only for export, but also for industrial output. So just a very simple example would be you have some kind of rare earth or critical raw material or mineral, whatever you want to call it. It's inside a rock. So the difference would be, do you just extract it and bring it somewhere else in China or Russia or US or EU? Or do you actually allow the country that is mining it to also process it, extract some value from it in terms of a supply chain or industrialization, or not? So the EU is clearly offering to industrialize and to have that type of partnership with Central Asia. And so in addition, it's also important to mention that the region of Central Asia offers a lot of skilled labor and migration. This may not seem so important in comparison to critical raw materials and other geoeconomic, geostrategic points that we see in the news, but actually it's of utmost importance. Labor shortage is a huge problem in many parts of the world today, especially various types of specific labor shortages. And that's also the reason why we've seen, for example, like various types of visa facilitation in recent years between the EU and Central Asia. From a geostrategic point of view, the EU sees Central Asia as a potential counterweight to superpowers, and it sees Central Asia as an ally of Europe. That includes Turkey in these efforts. And it's also clear that if Central Asia unites and integrates, it's an ally. It's a type of ally that can pose a counterweight to other superpowers. And I think, again, for anyone who reads the news, it's quite clear that there are a few of them around today, and that Europe feels under a lot of pressure as a result of this. And it essentially needs allies, which are small and medium-sized countries that are grouping together, a little bit like African Union, Mercosur, Central Asia is another example. In addition, the EU also sees, again, together with Turkey, the region of Central Asia and also the Trans-Caspian corridor, or the so-called middle corridor, as a reliable land route, and I stress land route, that connects Europe to Asia, and this means Chinese markets and Indian markets, essentially. And so all other routes go through maritime areas, and there are huge hurdles today. I mean, all you need to do is just look at current traffic disruptions in the Suez. I'm not going to go through all of these points, but essentially IMEC, Iraq, Iran, Suez are highly problematic points of transfer today. And so I think everyone kind of knows this story, but let's call it something along the lines of trade diversification, or you can also call it trade strategic autonomy. That's also how this middle corridor, Trans-Caspian corridor, is being viewed today from a strategic point of view. And Nargis, should I also talk about how Central Asia views the EU, or maybe I skip that, or what do you prefer?
If you want to make, Samuel, a couple of points, go ahead. Okay.
So then if we look at the reverse, like how does Central Asia, why is Central Asia interested in the EU? The reasons are not so dissimilar, so I will be more brief. But essentially, one is investment and trade. Without going into a lot of detail, there are lots of different types of trade agreements, ranging from GSP Plus to EPCA. And so the EU is gradually, one by one, negotiating such trade agreements with Central Asian republics. For example, Uzbekistan is basically at the end of one of those negotiations, the EPCA, whereas Kazakhstan finalized that negotiation already nearly 10 years ago now. And so in a nutshell, what is the result of this? Well, the result is huge amounts of investment. For example, the Netherlands has become the major investor in Kazakhstan. The EU by far is the #1 trade partner. And it's really a result of these trade agreements, which have opened up, Kazakh markets to primarily like pharmaceuticals and machinery, other goods as well, being imported from the EU, and vice versa the other way, petrochemicals, critical raw materials, of course, various other types of products which are being transported into EU. It's not only linked to these, there's also healthcare, various types of energy, and various types of logistic components as well, which are very important in the trade. So this is, of course, very, very important for the Central Asian republics. I give Kazakhstan as the best example because it's by far the most important example. Then regional integration. So here again, in the same way that the EU views regional integration as good for its aligned structure around the world with other countries, Central Asian republics, of course, also see the benefit of doing this, both in terms of heightened trade between those countries. I think I haven't looked at the figures recently, but in general, like the trade figures between Central Asian republics lay under 10%. And so I think even lower than that. And so, of course, by having a single market or working towards regional integration, that figure would increase. But it also provides a form of counterweight to, for example, trade negotiations with China or with other countries for that sake, even with the EU. I mean, just think about the simple practice of, for example, like how the EU, meaning EU27, would negotiate a trade agreement with China or China or the US for that sake, without having a common trade commissioner. It would basically be a much weaker negotiation from the individual country side. Then there's also the landlocked question. So, I mean, by having a relationship with the EU, Central Asia is essentially following the guidelines of the EBRD impact assessment, which is particularly concerning soft and hard infrastructure investments. And essentially, that allows Central Asia to gain a highway, a road, a connection with the outside world, which makes it more independent and also which allows it to trade its goods at better prices. And then finally, maybe also what I mentioned before, industrialization and tech. Central Asia is a region which very, very easily can become an island of no tech input, of no industry input. Right now, it has the option of negotiating with multiple partners, primarily Russia, China, and the EU. But in terms of tech and actual serious investment, it's probably just China and the EU with regards to industrializing and becoming, being able to have some tech transfer. So I think these are some of the points which are important for the region. There are also others as well, but I think that's what the governments are thinking about at the moment. And I mean, I can also say something about the summit, but maybe I can leave that for afterwards.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Can I confirm with you? So you are arguing that the EU will have more incentives to support the Middle Corridor. Is it the case? Or because we can also kind of consider the factor of resources. Now the EU will be so focused on strengthening itself, kind of putting all the resources into the military industrial complex, right? We see, for example, UK. Well, UK is not part of the EU, but UK is cutting aid in order to move the money, right, to the military industrial production. So kind of the EU has things to focus on. There are kind of these very urgent priorities. Would it still be ready to kind of support these other projects? Or is just so high on the geostrategic kind of agenda that they will continue to push? Kind of there are even more incentives to push for the Middle Corridor.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, if you, from a very basic strategic point of view, and this is purely, I mean, speculative strategic, it's not an official doctrine, and I'm not paraphrasing anyone in the EU or in a member state, but from a perfectly strategic, logical point of view, if a power like the United States is adding the type of pressure on the EU, which it currently is, there is no other logical way to counter it than through balancing that type of pressure with, for example, China. In order to do that, it can also be India, but it can also be other countries, but the most obvious case right now is probably China. And if one or member states are wishing to do so, the most autonomous trade corridor which exists in the world is the Middle Corridor for that purpose.
I find this very convincing. Can I ask you one more thing about the Russia factor? What's your sense? Is Central Asia now more vulnerable to Russian pressures? And could that serve as a constraint on the EU engagement with the region?
I don't have any doubt in my mind that Central Asia is under a lot of pressure at the moment. Unfortunately, I think the Central Asian governments are facing a very, very tough time right now, precisely because of the exact same reason I just mentioned before, with a rapprochement between Russia and the United States, inevitably discussions about the east-siding part of the north-south corridor has been reopened. This may not materialize, it may not work out, but it is absolutely being discussed. If the relationship between Washington and Russia is improving, which by all means it is, and I think there's a very logical reason for why it's improving. Some people attribute it to Donald Trump's character or Vance's retrograde, unprogressive ways of thinking. I think that is, of course, also true, but I think that there's a very specific strategy behind this, and it's the so-called popularized, we've known this for years, reverse Kissinger policy. It is not something new. It has been discussed for years, but we're now seeing it in practice. Whether this will work or not is a different story. I have no idea. But that's what's happening. And so if that is happening, one can only deduce logically, but there is also a lot of evidence suggesting that these meetings are taking place, which is that Central Asian north-south corridors are being discussed as well. Again, I'm not disputing that there are many, many problems with that corridor, arguably more problems than the east-west one, but that doesn't change the fact that it's up for discussion.
Well, but the cost of winning Russia, it seems to be incredibly high, right? Like the US is losing Europe. So, well, but anyways, that's a separate.
You have to ask yourself, what is the number one priority of the United States? It's definitely not the European Union's well-being. It's definitely not Central Asia's well-being either. It's probably not Russia's well-being either. It's their own national security. And their own national security dictates that the ultimate threat is China. And based on those assumptions, what they're doing is not illogical. It's unpleasant, and it's not friendly, but it's not illogical per se, I would argue.
I don't see much of a strategy, to be honest, in what the Trump administration is doing. But okay, we can get back to that later. Let's go to China. Eunice, can you share with us the findings of your research on China's interest, drivers, constraints, please?
So, hello again, dear colleague. Nice to meet you. I'm happy to see all of you. I'd like to give brief information about growing interest of China on middle corridor. So I'll try to divide two different factors. So why the middle corridor importance is growing for China. This is the first. The second, how China involved the middle corridor and what's its participation and what its target. So in terms of why middle corridor importance increasing for China, actually, we can tell different factors. But from my point of view, one of the factors is about changing geopolitical environment, particularly as you know, the growing sanction on Russia, maybe not directly threat the railway operations through the northern corridor, which goes through the Russia, but indirectly affect and increase uncertainty and also discourage international companies to use the northern corridor, the Russian route, with short said. So in this context, this is one of the factors that in this context, middle corridor emerge as an alternative. And second factor is that the war also shows China that dependence on only one land-based route for sustained trade with European Union, in addition to maritime route, actually is economic and geopolitical risk. This is a very important factor because we know that China has already sensitive on dependence on maritime route, but war also shows that China needs to diversify land-based routes. So in this context, again, since 2022, China pushed its effort to diversify the trade corridors. It's not only limited the middle corridor, But middle corridor emerged as one of the most important options because it goes through the stable countries, relatively stable countries. It goes through the sanction-free countries because we know that Russia is under sanction, and southern corridor, which goes through the Iran, Iran is also under sanction. So the middle corridor is a good option. Maybe it's not can replace totally the northern corridor, but it can play complementary role and offset some Chinese and European companies, the losers. This is the first factor that I will say as a geopolitical factor. Second and most important factor is about existence of multi-stakeholder. What I mean here, as you know, since 2022, local countries, particularly Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kazakhstan, eagerly try to invest their own domestic logistical capacity in order to develop hard and soft infrastructure, means railways, ports, and also the tariffs and customs. In addition to that, these countries also help each other to develop their infrastructure. For example, during the 2024, Baku-Tbilisi railway modernization was completed. Kazakhstan and Georgia jointly invest multimodal cargo terminal at port of Poti. They are all important because they coordinate each other. In addition to hard infrastructure, three countries built middle corridor multimodal joint venture, particularly focused on soft infrastructure, which is established for one-stop logistics service with guaranteed delivery times. So this is also important for China. But in addition to local countries' own capital, own intention to develop, there's also growing interest from the European Union countries, European Union itself, and European Union-related institutions. What I mean, EBRD, for example, invest Kazakhstan in order to improve railway operational efficiency. In addition to, as you know, during the Global Gateway Conference, European Union commit to invest $10 billion to Trans-Caspian corridors for the near future. Why this is important for China? Because the last 10 years, actually say last 9 years, we saw that rather than taking the all burden itself or being the single investor, particularly in a big project, China preferred to engage with the different shareholders, different stakeholders in order to reduce the risk and diversify the portfolio. So in this context, when we look the multi-stakeholder engagement, local countries and European Union countries' existence, this creates another condition for China's involvement because, as I noted before, it reduced the risk and helped China to involve rather than taking the whole burden, being part of the solution and contribute to the development of the middle corridor. I would say this is the most important, the second factor from the change, actually, China's perception toward middle corridor and promote to reconsider its approach through the route. And finally, and most importantly, I would say that decreasing cost of sending cargo through the middle corridor is also another factor because before the war, one of the most important reasons that China has a very limited engagement, particularly before 2022, it's about the cost of sending cargo through the middle corridor because before the war, cost of cargo to send through the middle corridor is almost 2 times expensive than northern corridor through the Russian road. However, as I noted before, due to the joint effort of regional countries, European Union's involvement, these countries considerably decrease the cost. We can say that currently it's again cheaper than Russian road, no, but it's now competitive. This is a very important factor because we know that Chinese companies, as like the European companies, they also look for the cost-efficient route. And currently middle corridor offer that. And when we combine all of these factors, decreasing cost, improvement of hard and soft infrastructure, and changing geopolitical condition, this is a good justification that we can say China has a reason to improve or increase its interest in toward the middle corridor. But what's that mean, China's involvement? So first, during the 2023 and 2024, we saw that China signed bilateral agreement with Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kazakhstan, and they jointly state that they both sides have an intention to develop middle corridor for development and optimization. This is very important because before 2022, mostly regional, local countries itself issued this problem. They try to promote China to jointly develop, but we saw that it's very limited and there is no clear intention from China's side. But currently, both sides have a strong intention and they jointly state that they want to develop the corridor. This is the first important factor. But in addition to statement, there is already a hard fact about China's involvement. The first is, as I noted before, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Georgia was established a middle corridor multimodal joint venture. Just during the 2024, China Railway Container Transport Company participate to this joint venture. This is also another indicator that China has a growing interest, and the company tried to coordinate its operational work through the Middle Corridor countries. It's particularly important for soft infrastructure. The second, actually, when we generally talk about China's investment or the infrastructure investment, mostly we saw that in particular in Central Asia, railway infrastructure, development or road transportation. But when we directly look the Middle Corridor, we saw that China target the port development. For example, as you know, currently China and Chinese companies also only winner of the Anakya Deep Sea project. They invested and they have intention to build this deep sea project. It's particularly critical project for Georgia because it boosts the Black Sea coast of the Middle Corridor section. It boosts countries' efficiency as a transit country and reduce congestion. This is the first important factor. Second, last year again, China and Kazakhstan signed new agreement on jointly invest to build intermodal terminal at Akto Port. This is the second the clear indicator that China involved for development of the port in the Caspian coast also. And finally, during the COP29, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and China signed new agreement on jointly built intermodal terminal in Alat port of Azerbaijan. So as you saw in the Black Coast and also in Caspian, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, they're all the port countries, and China directly involved the development of these ports. The main aim is here, reduce the congestion, traffic problem, increase efficiency, and increase these countries' handling capacity. But why specifically the port? The reason actually is very basic, because when we look the Middle Corridor obstacles, bottlenecks, the most pressing issues is related to ports. Due to their technical the limits, for example, the lack of hard infrastructure in the port, as I mentioned it, also lack of terminals or limited handling capacity is the major issues, or lack of fleet. And we saw that China directly target and involved through the port and participate the Middle Corridor and contribute to solutions. So when we combine this engagement and also the China's direct involvement to try to solve the logistical issues for the Middle Corridor, this give us chance to tell that before the 2022, China has a very limited engagement, but our current time, particularly since the 2022, China has an increasing interest in the Middle Corridor, and they try to contribute a solution. And Chinese, not only China, but already we saw that Chinese companies also involved. They're start using the Middle Corridor, such as Costco, for example, is one of the company. In this context, it gives us the chance to say that China has a growing commitment, and it tried to diversify the route through the Middle Corridor for mitigate geopolitical risk. And it can use the Middle Corridor as a wider component of its strategy to increase its economic influence in Central Asia, but most importantly in South Caucasus, because China is new actor in South Caucasus, and Middle Corridor create chance to increase its influence through the Middle Corridor and its involvement. And most importantly, it's my final point, its investment or its involvement in the Middle Corridor indirectly help the local countries, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, to create new route for their export and import, because as you know, most of these countries, particularly Central Asian countries, has a huge dependency on export and import routes through the Russia. And development of Middle Corridor also create another channel that maybe not fully replace, but reduce their at least relatively dependence on Russia. So thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Nargis.
Thank you very much, Yunus. Well, you talked about new investments in the Middle Corridor. How about subsidies? What's happening there? Because cargo is subsidized, and
Yes.
they're kind of well, for a long time there have been all these conversations about subsidies being reduced, and sort of eliminated.
Yeah, it's particularly correct when we talk about an open corridor, which goes to the Russia, because since the 2000s, actually after 2008, the China started to subsidize this route. But currently in the Middle Corridor, there is no indication that that China also subsidy the middle corridor. But from my point of view, as I noted, for the fact the bilateral engagement, its involvement to port issues, and also its intention to also help these countries to build fleet in the Caspian Sea, for example, the Kazakhstan, they all indicate that maybe in near future, China also involved for the subsidy. But that's also the challenging thing, because we know that China actually want to reduce subsidy, not for just middle corridor, but also through the northern corridor. It try to promote companies to work themselves and create efficiency themselves rather than state support. So from my point of view, the currently maybe it's not a topic, because as I noted, for countries joint effort actually start to reduce the cost. And if it's needed, I don't think that China started to gives new subsidies for the middle corridor, but maybe most importantly, it again continue to engage for the hard infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Yunus. Timur, can we go to you? Yunus already started kind of framing the middle corridor in the kind of bigger China strategy in Eurasia. What's your take on it? How does China see all these changes, big changes, and kind of so tell us what you think. China, Central Asia, Middle Corridor, South Caucasus, Russia, US, and Europe, and so on. So what's going on?
What a beautiful menu I have. What to start with? I will start with agreeing with the most what Eunice have said about China's perception of the middle corridor and its potential to increase and most importantly give China another alternative to the existing trade routes that it has with European market. And I think considering what is happening right now between the US and European Union, and considering that European Union is thinking about its own China policy, which will definitely be different from Trump's China policy, I think much of the relationship in the future between China and EU will depend on how the decision makers right now in Brussels or other capitals in Europe will decide what will be their stance on relationship with Beijing. But overall, I would say that the middle corridor is just one part of what China is interested in Eurasia. And of course, Eurasia is huge. There are many countries, and China has different stakes in different regions. Russia stands out from Eurasia, and here for China, this is number one partner. It's not an ally. China refuses to call Russia an ally, but it's a very close, much closer than Central Asian countries, for example, country that has much more to put on the table of the relationship with China. But nevertheless, Central Asian countries are also quite important for China for different reasons. And I would say that security considerations come here number one priority for China. It was always a priority for Chinese foreign policy in the region, and it continues to be, considering what happened in Afghanistan in 2021, considering what recently happened in Syria, and how it can have its minor but still very tangible influence on the situation in Central Asia. All of those considerations from the security perspective are important for China and will continue to be. If I would say China's foreign policy towards the region overall is more of a reactive, the only exception from this rule will be the security part of it. In security, China is proactive in and all of the new initiatives that are popping up in Central Asia in security cooperation with China are mostly coming from the initiative from Beijing's side, not originating in Central Asia. But in other spheres, in economy, in logistics, I would say that China is rather responding to the requests that it gets from its Central Asian partnerships. Of course, Belt and Road Initiative is a very well-known, huge infrastructure project that many people see as China's instrument of increasing its global influence, but we should also keep in mind that Belt and Road is something that leaderships in Central Asian countries wanted from the very beginning, and it's the beautiful nature of its ideological package is that all of the Central Asian countries also had their own vision of the continuation or rejuvenation of the ancient Silk Road, and the fact that China has used those narratives in creating this economic Silk Road in the new century has also played a huge role on the success of the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia. So I would say that the recent events that happened in the last 3 years, and also the Trump administration's new I can't also call them strategies, because I agree with Nargis that I don't see a strategic approach to Donald Trump's foreign policy. Maybe this is the strategy, not to show the strategy and to put your opponents into a very strange position where everybody's trying to guess what will be the next move, and the next move is so unpredictable that no one cannot adapt to it beforehand. But what I think will definitely be one of the implications of that in China's presence in Eurasia is that it will continue to be growing. China needs more reliable partners across the world. China needs more stable ways of diversification, not only in logistical part of its presence in Eurasia, but also in economic, in political, ideological, and here Central Asian countries and South Caucasus countries more increasingly are have proved that they are loyal partners to China, and they are ready to sometimes ideologically align with Chinese worldviews to get more economic benefits from this partnership. And I don't see any signs of this in the nearest decades going down. And actually, the fact that the current administration in Washington is so much focused on China. However, the instruments they're using to compete with Beijing are in a way self-harming. The way the US has withdrawn all of the funding through USAID and other organization has for sure damaged the presence of the US in those regions that we're talking about. The way the current administration is damaging its allied relationship with Europe is also damaging the presence of the US and, broadly speaking, the West in the region that we're talking about. And but the request, the demand for more presence, more investment, and more cooperation isn't going anywhere. It will just go to those countries that are interested in being present in Central Asia or South Caucasus. So from that point of view, I don't see how the current administration in the US will be able to instrumentalize its new foreign policy vision to compete with China, at least in Eurasia. Of course, when we, it's a separate topic when we speak about direct competition on the matters that are completely bilateral between the US and China. Maybe in this part, the new approach of Washington will be effective. However, when we're speaking about third regions, this is my biggest doubt for now. And also, I wanted to end by the messenger strategy that Samuel has already mentioned, and he was doubting whether it's going to work or not. Here, I have a clear vision that it's not going to work. What happened between the US and China in the 70s was a unique moment when both China and the US wanted to lower the influence of the USSR. And it was the moment when the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was in its low. Right now, we're talking about the relationship between Russia and China that is on its record high. There are minuscule problems that exist between Moscow and Beijing that can create some sort of competition or confrontation. And because of that, I don't see how and what the current administration in the US has to propose to Russia to change its strategic view about China. So that will be my last point, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Timur. And that's what the experts in Moscow are saying, right? That now there will be this triumvirate of powers, Russia, China, and US, ruling the world. You said a very thought-provoking thing at the beginning, saying that Russia is closer to China than Central Asian states. I think you kind of, well, we can argue about that, right? Because on the one hand, I think there is more trust and less less competition between China and Central Asian states than between China and Russia. And China views Central Asia as its neighborhood, right? Very friendly neighborhood and sort of sphere of influence. And Russia is on par, right? It's another power with which it can do things together, and definitely the kind of this combating the US hegemony was something that kind of pushed Russia and China together, and now it will be interesting to see what's going to happen. So I don't know who is closer. It seems to me that Central Asians are closer, kind of at least longer term, closer to China, but we can kind of it's not that important for this discussion. And on your influence on the influence of the US in Central Asia, that it will be in decline. I agree with you, but at the same time, many people in our regions like Trump and like Trump administration. They know that there will be no pressure on with regard to democracy, human rights, good governance, and all that. That you can make deals with the Trump administration. You can offer your resources, and then you will be good. And we saw what Georgia did, how it tried to endear itself to the US and co-sponsored the US resolution, the UN General Assembly. Unthinkable, right? The country that lost 20% of its territory to due to Russia's invasion. But anyhow, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Let me encourage participants to ask questions. We already have some excellent questions in the Q&A. You can post them here. Those who watch us on YouTube, you can post your questions there, and our team will transfer them to me. So let's start with the questions. One question was for you, Samuel. You mentioned that Netherlands was #1 trade investment partner in Kazakhstan. How much of that is circular investment? That is Kazakh money going to banks in Europe and then coming back. That used to be the trend. Is it still?
Okay, it's quite a specific question. What I can say about that is that so the EU overall is the #1 trade partner. When you look at individual country level foreign direct investment, it fluctuates year by year. But for a year and a half consistently, if I'm not mistaken, it might even be 2 years, it's the Netherlands, last 2. It's true that in the past, I mean, the Netherlands is a financial capital in some ways in terms of investment, a bit like London as well. And a lot of it has been this type of investment in the past. But in recent years, a lot of the investment which has come both from the Netherlands as well as Germany has been linked to renewable energy, but also to traditional energy. That's been quite important. Another very important investment flow has been in the medicinal and agri sector. So there's been a lot of investment from the Netherlands in essentially, it's a combination. It's not only, it's a lot of it is service related as well, in terms of actually providing services on agriculture, increasing agricultural productivity, intensive agricultural farming, but also like a lot of service from business to business. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the quick answer to that question is no, it is not just going into the banking sector. It's changed. But of course, to say that that doesn't exist any longer is of course also not true. But it's not the same as 15 years ago, if that's what the question is.
Thank you. Can I go to you, Yunis, with this question? In light of the Middle Corridor's substantially higher transportation costs, reportedly around 15 times those of conventional maritime routes, the absence of significant intermediate consumer markets to spur additional revenue from ports of call, and the shallow water infrastructure limitations at ports like Atirau, Baku, and Batumi, it seems unlikely that private capital markets would commit the large-scale investments needed to develop the corridor. Given these structural and commercial obstacles, further compounded by the logistical challenges of relying on extensive truck or rail shipments, how does the panel, how do you see Central Asian states attracting the necessary financing and international commitments to make this project viable? I would add South Caucasus, the countries of South Caucasus, to the question as well.
So actually, these problems already exist in the last decade, and we saw that there's just clear differences that, as I noted before the war, it's very difficult to South Caucasian countries and Central Asian countries to mobilize the resource from generally for international institution or from the European side or China side. But after the war, there's a growing interest in development because of the Russian aggression, and also both European Union and China's willingness to diversify the routes for sustainable land-based transit. So in this context, we can talk about the several actually existing of the several capital. The first, actually, when we talk about private sector and private capital for realization of this type of project, I wouldn't say that never depends on the private capital or private sector. It's always driven by state-led companies or state willingness and also international institutions involvement. In this context, I think that the local countries, for example, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, use their own resource, or they jointly invest to develop port infrastructure or railway infrastructure. For example, Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway, or Kazakhstan and Georgia's joint investment to Port of Poti. Or second, we saw that, as I noted before, involvement from China, that they try to develop port. In addition to that, recently, China and Kazakhstan discussed that China support the building of the new fleet for the Caspian coast, which is another actually issue through the middle corridor, lack of the fleet. And China also steadily, not specifically, I won't say the middle corridor, but invest the railway infrastructure which connect China and Kazakhstan. In addition to local countries and China's involvement, there's an involvement from EBRD, Asia Development Bank. For example, EBRD invest the Kazakhstan railway and issued a bond for improving the operational efficiency. Asia Development Bank invests to Georgia in order to improve efficiency of Baku-Tbilisi railway. In addition to that, most importantly, the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank, China-led Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank, recently declared 2 different projects, one for Kazakhstan, another for the Turkey, the development of railway infrastructure, the eastern part of the Turkey. Both of them is very important. So actually, when we talk about the capital, maybe yes, there is a still preventing component for private sector to invest, but international institutions, local countries own capital, and regional powers has an intention to develop. Actually, that's the most important things, that there is an intention and their capital and invest. And actually, I will say that last 2 years, there's a huge development, but still the critical obstacles exist. But I will say that in the current time, there's a growing commitment for the development of corridor.
Thank you very much. And I think more than a year ago, we had an event with the World Bank expert studying the middle corridor, and he said there is no problem with financing the corridor. There is plenty of finance out there. I don't know what's going to happen now, but anyhow, can I ask you one more question, Yunus? Is there competition between the middle corridor and the international north-south transport corridor?
So actually, there's a lot of debate about that, whether the middle corridor and northern-southern corridor can compete each other. Actually, I will say that in the current, particularly after the war, one of the most important driver of developer of the north-south corridor is Russia, because Russia, in order to diversify the trade routes, try to invest or at least develop both the western side of the northern southern corridor, which goes through the South Caucasus, particularly in Azerbaijan, and the eastern side of, as Samuel mentioned, goes through the Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So, but there's an obstacle in that part because Russia has a problem related to financing. India also actually seem as an investor, but there is no clear indication that India want to invest for the development. That's a point, a major point here, because as you mentioned, in middle corridor, when we talk about east and west, there's already resource, capital, intention. But when we talk about north-south corridor, I wouldn't say that. And in terms of competition, actually, they serve in different purposes. And I wouldn't say that there's a competition, but maybe there we can say that there's a complementary the part of this both of corridor. So actually, when we look the media, yes, we saw that a lot of debates about competition, but I would say that it's a complementary rather than compete each other.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to you, Timur, and to also to Samuel to talk about EU-China, China-EU relations? Timur, we saw Chinese foreign minister's charm offensive at Munich conference. We also they kind of noticed the softening of the EU officials' rhetoric on China over the past weeks. How do you think China's EU policy will be changing? Before, it seems to me that it was trying to split Europe, right? To kind of create a camp of China-friendly countries, and so that the EU cannot put together a strong unified policy. So what would be your prediction? what will China try to do now under the new circumstances? And Samuel, the same question to you, but kind of what the EU will be you think what the EU will try doing under the new circumstances. And let's see if tariffs are imposed, right? If there is a tariff war, definitely there will be an interest in, if tariffs are imposed on the EU and kind of heightened on China, definitely that makes the two of them kind of, that will push them closer to each other. But what's your thinking on that? Timur, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you. What I have learned about Europe after living here for almost 2 years is that Europe is a huge bureaucratical machine. And if anything changes here, it takes a long time. So if something has happened this month, it means that it will take years for European Union to come with an effective, working, up-to-date strategy on China. So my take is we will not see huge changes. But we can see some of the changes happening with some of the countries on China. And here, of course, European capitals will definitely like China's attention to Europe as an important member of everything that is happening globally, because the US seems to be ignoring Europe whatsoever. And in this, in this view of Europe, the current Trump administration is very close to Russia's approach, which doesn't see Europe as an agent in international relationship. And for that reason, any country, and especially a very influential country like China, when it puts a spotlight on European Union and says that European Union is an important player in the war in Ukraine and we should, cooperate on bringing the peace. All of those talks are, of course, tasty as honey for European ears, and they will love China's more attention to Europeans' agency in this regard. However, China will not stop from dividing Europe. China has its favorite EU member states, and with those countries and with those leaders, China will continue to play the same game as it used to do previously, and now maybe European Union will consider those countries to be to try to weaponize them and weaponize them for their own good, and to bring them as the bridges between the countries that the collective European Union doesn't really have a good rapport, like the Trump administration or Xi Jinping in Beijing. So my take is that the maximum that we can expect from European Union is somehow adapt to the new realities, but not to change the strategy completely. And from the Chinese side, I think that they are seeing an opening in the observed crack between the US and European Union, and they will definitely step in and try to instrumentalize it for their own good.
Samuel, do you agree? Because it is a special moment. We know that the EU moves incredibly slowly, but when the kind of the moment arises, they can do things fast.
It's 27 nations, to try to integrate 450 million people is nothing short of historical by any precedent, especially when you think about what, we're not talking about, let alone the fact that you would never unite 450 million 500 years ago because the population wouldn't be there. But beyond that, trying to unify a huge chunk of territory with that amount of people and capital also in any historical moment would have led to war, to be frank. That said, today the attempt is being made not just between leaderships and between military alliances. It's being done with fiscal harmonization, institutional harmonization, regulatory harmonization, banking insurance harmonizations, very complex procedures, arguably nearly never been tried before. And hence, of course, it is a very slow and difficult process. But I think also it's fair to say that the gains are huge. I won't go into detail, but I think anyone who knows a little bit about economics and security can nothing but agree with the fact that uniting 27 on all these levels is of course extremely advantageous, simply in negotiating trade agreements and many other things as well. I think I would remind everyone that during COVID, maybe that's also what Nargis alluded to, during COVID, when the EU got a big smack on the head, they finally got their act together and they doubled their budget. That's unusual, for the majority of the EU's existence, if not all of their existence, up until only a few years ago, the budget nearly stayed the same, about 1% of the overall GDP, and it doubled overnight because of a crisis. I think it's not unfair to expect that something very similar will happen. I know there's a lot of media going around about how the EU doesn't have the firepower and the finances and all these kind of things. That's simply not true. No financial calculation would dictate that. I do, however, think that the EU, and more importantly, its private wealth funds and its own capital markets and companies, etc., are very careful in their expenditure. Those are two different things. So when there's high risk, expect high expenditure, I believe. But indeed, time will tell. About China, I think I'm not a China specialist. I don't deal with EU-China relations particularly. So I can just say, look for the things. Well, first of all, of course, China will try to divide the EU. There's no state that doesn't try to do that. I mean, it would go against their inherent motivation towards achieving power if they didn't do that, I think. So I think anyone would do that. But that said, as was mentioned by Timur and yourself and Yunus before, this is of course seen as an opportunity for China. They will try to rally the Europeans against the United States. There's no doubt about that. And how will they do it exactly? Well, I think they might look towards the automotive industry. They might look towards solar panels and renewable. Let's just look back at the last few years. What were the biggest concerns? I'm not taking this out of any policy memorandum or anything like that, just from the newspapers. What was really discussed? What were the major issues for the EU? Anti-dumping, subsidies. For the US, it was more technology transfer and issues, but I think we can look at those issues from the EU. Middle corridor, I think, will also be a very important one as well. And I think those are ones to look out for.
Thank you. A question maybe to Samuel and Yunus, maybe one of you can address it or both. Is there competition between the route via Georgia and Turkey? Or it's complementary, Yunus?
Actually, it's a bit tricky question. I would say that if we talk about the middle corridor, Turkey is a part of the middle corridor, not actually the Black Coast part. But in terms of the diversification, it's important to keep off the both route efficient through the Georgia, Black Sea coast, and the European Union countries, and through the Turkey and the European Union. But when we look from the China and China's involvement, we saw that China tried to keep both of them, because as I noted, China want to build Anak airport, but I also gave fact about that China led Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank also invest Turkey's the eastern part of the railway section for developing. So I don't say that they compete, but again I will tell the same things, that they're complementary, because diversification is the main things in the Chinese strategy, because as I noted, there is a problem in Northern Corridor, which goes through Russia. So China's most important aim is to diversify as possible as, not for only China, but it's also for the local countries. For example, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan also want to keep both routes open, because currently Turkey route is much visible because there's no war, there's a stability, but Black Sea coast is much vulnerable due to the war. So, but as you know, international system is changing, international system is anarchic. Maybe it's time coming for the importance of the Black Sea coast. So I think that it's good to keep both of them efficient and continue to invest it.
Okay. Well, we know that the Trump administration left the Paris Agreement. Well, climate change is a hoax. Renewable energy is a dirty word. And I was wondering what will be the kind of the impact on the plans to make the middle corridor green, right? We heard kind of a lot of intentions, plans to make it sort of a green gateway, and so on. At the same time, we do have kind of the EU is a big champion of green energy, green transition. China is also a big champion of green transition. Will they kind of keep the middle corridor development green or not, you think?
Is question for me?
Whoever wants to comment on that. Eunice, if you want to.
Okay. So as you mentioned, the China currently play as a champion role in green technology, not in renewable technology, and it's a main exporter of the electric vehicles to Central Asia and South Caucasus actually. And currently there's a rising trend about zero emission trucks for the transportation through from China to Europe. And again, the main driver is actually Chinese companies. For example, Windrose is one of them. And there's an increasing export from China to Central Asia and also South Caucasian countries. And for making the corridor green, it's not, we shouldn't only focus the electric vehicles, but there is also comprehensive package. Actually, for example, electric charger is very important. It's a one other component. And I would say that currently the Central Asian countries, let's say most specifically Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan is the main player in this context. In South Caucasus, Azerbaijan and Georgia try to develop the corridors through the country for adding more electric charger, because they need to integrate it and they try to reduce the pollution and carbon emission. So we can say that there's a development, but it doesn't mean that actually there is a strategy. So making the corridor green. Maybe in this context, European Union can play much better role, because as you know, in terms of regulatory affairs, when we talk about the green technologies, European Union is the leading actor in the international system. Maybe China not.
Can I reframe a little bit my question, because I think I didn't ask it in a good way. So we have US withdrawing, but it's actually drawing on already existing trend, kind of businesses, governments realizing that the costs of transition are very high, right? So now we have big companies cutting their commitments on transition, kind of cutting down on fossils and so on and so forth. We have kind of problems in the EU and the EU Green Deal, because it is very expensive, and now you have this kind of the war on your border, and your security is in danger. So it's a kind of difficult situation. The whole global context is changing. Kind of the range of threats, risks, challenges you're dealing with is changing. So Samuel, from the European perspective, what do you think is going to happen? Will we have the same incentive structure to to build the middle corridor as a green corridor?
Well, I mean, I think first thing we can look at what was the EBRD impact assessment by the European Commission. I mean, I call it the impact assessment, but the real name is, I'm opening it, Sustainable Transport Connection between Europe and Central Asia. So even in the title, it says sustainable. And when you then go through the document, you'll see like there's a lot of effort that goes into precisely trying to make it greener, trying to make it more renewable and more sustainable material, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in a nutshell, I think the answer is that it will not be that affected. I think China is investing, and the EU as well, and the US pre-Donald Trump as well. And there are reasons for why the US is not doing that now. Had they been in a slightly different circumstance, had they not discovered that amount of shale gas and had the issues with Russia and so on not occurred, they would also have been pursuing a green environmental policy. And the reason is very simple, is that there is a well, I don't know, you call it ethical, existential reason, meaning if we don't, the Earth will not sustain itself, especially with regards to water, which would be a huge problem. I mean, and then number two reason is also whoever discovers this technology in the most effective way first has two comparative advantages. And the first one is they will be self-sustainable. Energy lay at the root of geopolitics. It is everything for geopolitics. And as a result, the one who finds this key I mean, for example, nuclear is also autonomous, but you need to get the thorium or the uranium somewhere, right? So France's 56 reactors need that uranium. We saw what happened in Mali. So now instead it's mined elsewhere. But that means it's not fully autonomous, whereas renewable energy really is. So it's a huge discovery in geopolitics if the one who manages to pull that off, whether it be China or the EU and so on. And in that respect, the United States is at a loss. That's without a doubt. And the second thing is whoever discovers it will be selling this technology. And that's also a huge, concrete, let's say, geopolitical benefactor. And so to answer your question about that, I think that it very much stays a priority, and I think it will be very, very important. And yeah, so both in terms of the impact assessment, I think it's clear that it's a priority, and number two, also in terms of let's say geopolitics, existential needs, it will be very important as well. Then, if we look at Central Asia, because we've spoken a lot about great power, competition, and whatnot, if we look at Central Asia itself. It also makes a lot of sense for the region to focus on renewable energy. I mean, also because a country like Kazakhstan, for example, is enormous, and as a result, it can use its scale of land mass in order to accumulate more energy through, for example, solar paneling. I know that this information dictates that solar panels are ugly and they're environmentally polluting, visually at least. True, but okay, I mean, what else are you going to do with a bunch of steppe, right? I mean, there's so much space that can be utilized for this great gain. And so I think for Central Asian countries, especially for Kazakhstan, but also for the other ones, it's very much in their gain to also focalize on this and continue focalizing on it.
Yeah, and in the future, we might be able to export electricity to Europe, and green hydrogen and all that. So in kind of revitalizing the Silk Road, we need to be forward looking, and I think that's an excellent way to end our seminar today. Thank you so much, Samuel, Eunice, and Timur for joining us and sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights. I hope we will gather again maybe in a year to discuss the developments, maybe less given the pace of events. Thank you so much, and thank you our viewers for tuning in and also for asking your excellent questions. I apologize to those whose questions we could not address. And thank you to our events team here at the Davis Center for making this possible.